Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to give this just a few seconds while people are joining. As we're joining, it's always fun to know where people are coming from. So if you want to put your location in the chat, it's always nice to see. And we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Cameron Trimble. I'm the CEO and founder of an organization called Convergence, and we are very lucky to work in partnership with the Anderson Forum for Progressive Theology, those fabulous, fun folks in South Carolina and beyond who get together and nerd out on big theological ideas. So this is part of the great fun that we get to have together. We're on Zoom, as you know, and our way of being together is that you're welcome to use the chat feature for resourcing one another. Let's don't just, have sidebar conversations. Let's keep it relevant. And then throughout the presentation, if you'd like to put questions in the Q&A box, please feel free to do so. I'll be fielding those. We'll have a time in the our program where we'll have a chance to dialogue and engage the questions as they occur to you. So if you are like me, a middle-aged woman whose memory is not what it used to be, please feel free to write your questions as they come. I'm finding I have to go into a new room and write down why I'm there as I go in. So maybe it's just me. So we're very excited for today's program. I'm thrilled to introduce to you Teresa, who will then introduce our speaker, and we will begin.
Thank you, Cameron. Welcome to Metaphors for God, Disrupting the Familiar and Embracing the Uncanny with Dr. Heather Macumber. I'm Teresa Jones, a board member of the Anderson Forum for Progressive Theology, the sponsor for today's event. And as you noted, our technology wizard is the Reverend Cameron Trimble, and we are delighted to have her always. She makes all the wheels turn, and we appreciate it. Dr. Macumber is from Canada, Manitoba, Canada. She was born in Canada, educated in Canada, and now studies, writes, and teaches in Canada. Some of us, may envy her, and I won't say more about that. She is Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at Providence University College in Otterburn. She received an MDiv from Tyndale University and a PhD in Old Testament from St. Michael's College. Dr. Macumber has appeared as a guest on the popular podcast, The Bible for Normal People. And she's a contributor to the visual commentary on scripture organized by King's College, London. She has published in academic journals, including the Journal of Hebrew Scriptures, Biblical Interpretation, and the Journal for Interdisciplinary Biblical Studies. Dr. Macumber's work focuses on the intersection of the divine and earthly, as found predominantly in Jewish prophetic and apocalyptic texts. Her recent publications employ monster theory as a critical lens that, in Dr. Macumber's expert hands, works in concert with post-colonial feminist and womanist theories to examine what counts as monstrous in Daniel, Revelation, and the Dead Sea Scrolls, and why, as well as how that reading reveals or can reveal the concerns of the ancient culture that produced the texts, as well as the concerns and biases and blindnesses of contemporary readers who, from practice and habit, may see only what they expect to see instead of the many and varied perspectives that are there to see. As Dr. Macumber says, in speaking of her work on Revelation, monster theory is one way to read it. It's one lens. It's not the only lens. But as she demonstrates in her marvelous 2021 book, Recovering the Monstrous in Revelation, in the right hands, in her hands, that lens makes for a challenging, eye-opening, intellectually compelling way to begin. We are delighted to have you with us today.
Well, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm going to share my screen, so let me know if there's any problems. I hope that works. I'm going to assume it works. All right, well, it's lovely to join you today. And as that wonderful introduction by Teresa discussed, my work is primarily on monster theory and uncovering the uncanny. Today's talk is going to be a little bit of a I guess, a sidebar to that. Not so much focused on the monster theory aspect of it, but focusing on metaphor as a vehicle for introducing us to more uncanny aspects, maybe disorienting aspects of the divine. All of this is in concert with monster theory, so feel free in the question and answer to bring that up because this is very much, I think, a parallel project to what I've been doing. So it is a truth universally acknowledged that certain metaphors are more familiar to readers than others. To speak about God as a shepherd does not raise eyebrows, whether it's in the church or in society. But when we start to call God perhaps other unsettling metaphors like an eyelid, maybe a lion or a midwife, it often surprises people and even produces disbelief. So I often have to justify or find these metaphors to convince people they're in the Bible. And today I want to take you on a tour of some of the more these unfamiliar metaphors that are almost never part of liturgies or worship or cultural discourse. And though the strangeness of these metaphors may predispose us to dismiss them as perhaps irrelevant, maybe even irreverent, I want to show you today that even if they're a minority, they're actually quite important about how we conceive the divine. Popular metaphors such as God as Father and Shepherd and King are ingrained in a culture. Like they're things that people sing about, they're part of historical prayers, they're abundant. But their very abundance hides an alternate, and I would argue, necessary picture of the divine or who God is. And today, my goal is to unearth these forgotten metaphors of God and persuade you that their uncanniness, their disorienting nature, shows new facets of how humans can understand God, both in the ancient world and also today. So to begin with, I want to talk about what is a metaphor. And basically to start the basics. So when I was in school, in regular public school, we were always taught a very standard version of a metaphor, that a metaphor is a comparison between two objects. And it differs from a simile because a simile will always include the qualifiers like or as. And so these two, whether it's a metaphor or simile, we're just comparing two objects. And that's where my public education ended. But I want today to go a little further into why metaphor theory is important, especially because metaphors abound in the Hebrew Bible. So let's take an example. God is like a fortress would be considered a simile, but God is a fortress would be considered a metaphor, because in the God is a metaphor, the two terms, God and fortress, or sorry, God is a fortress, are brought closer together. There's no like or as to give any kind of distance or separation between the two of them. And so they both use the imagery of fortress. But again, the metaphor seems to make this a stronger connection between the two. And when we use the word comparison, and I find this all the time with students, is a lot of times they forget that when we compare, we also contrast. And so when metaphors are used in the Hebrew Bible, especially, or the New Testament, the people tend to just think of what is similar, rather than just looking at maybe what is dissimilar, what doesn't work when we compare these two pieces of language together. And so, for example, when you think God is a fortress, what images come up? So I think most people, first of all, would say, the ideas of strength and protection and permanence. That God is a fortress is a positive image of how God is relating to Israel. However, as I said, at the heart of the metaphor is bringing two actually different things together, because it makes less sense to bring two things together that are very similar than it does to make two dissimilar objects in relationship to one another, because we're trying to understand through the source, like the thing we're actually trying to understand God, we're trying to understand God through this other image. And so I really like the work of Derrida. He talks about the is and the is not quality of the metaphor. And so he would ask, if he was going to talk about God as fortress, something like, how is God not like a fortress? Where does the metaphor actually collapse? So where does human language, where is it unable to talk about the source material? And here we're talking about God. And so you might answer, perhaps if we were in a classroom setting, that fortresses, though they're strong, do break down eventually. that they're not something that lasts forever. They are the work of humans after all. And I have a quote here by N.T. Wright that I really like. He says, metaphor consists of bringing two sets of ideas close together, close enough for a spark to jump, but not too close, so that the spark in jumping illuminates for a moment the whole area around, changing perceptions as it does so. So writers, novelists, authors, they're all really familiar with the concept of an imperfect metaphor, that the metaphor can only carry you so far, that as a vehicle, you can describe it to an extent before it breaks down. But I love this idea that we can bring two sets of ideas together, God and fortress, and we highlight the commonalities, but at the same time, you can see in the shadows that there are things that actually aren't highlighted, that don't help illuminate the other. And metaphors are particularly effective, I said, when we're looking at two different things. And so another theorist, Sally McFagg, she writes, since metaphors are imaginative leaps across a distance, the best metaphors always give both a shock and a shock of recognition. A metaphoric theology will dare to take risks as well, for recognition does not come without that shock. And that's what I want to focus on today. I want to focus on that shock, that uncanniness that happens, that can surprise us, it can frighten us, and I think actually delight us. These metaphors abound in the Hebrew Bible, but unfortunately, they're hidden from sight, whether intentionally or not intentionally. I always tell my students they're languishing in the dusty corners of the Bible. And so this morning, or this afternoon, I guess, I have chosen three to look at: God as eyelid, God as hunter, and God as midwife. And again, my students never believe me, especially that God is described as an eyelid, but I promise you it's really there in the text. But before we get to each of these metaphors, I want to give you a challenge to do this week or next month, or whether it's individually or as a community. And it's an activity I often do with my students. And it's to help people analyze, to assess what metaphors are primary and central to the way they speak about God. And so I encourage people to take a piece of paper, a tablet, a phone, and take some time to, take 5 minutes, write out all the ways that you think about God. What metaphors, whether they be animate or inanimate, whether they're primarily from the Old Testament, the New Testament, whether they are perhaps not even in the Bible. Maybe there are things that are drawn from like Christian church history, but to think about all the ways that one conceives about the divine. And so write them all down, and then I ask people to spend some time looking at what they've written down. And it's really fun to do it as a word cloud with students. And if you haven't done word clouds, it's this idea of whatever is the largest text is the one that is the most meaningful or the biggest in terms of its significance. And then as it decreases, it will like in significance, it decreases in size. And so I wanted to show you my own evolution in terms of metaphor and how I conceive of the divine. And so this is me circa 1998. So this is 18-year-old Heather, just graduated from high school, about to go into university. And you can see here from my metaphors that the most central, largest, biggest metaphor you can see is God as Father, closely followed by God as Shepherd, and then you have things like Creator, Redeemer, Protector. All of these metaphors are metaphors that really connote like safety, protection. They're really, really positive metaphors. And so even things like rock and shelter are there as well. So again, it's pretty much similar in terms of like what the metaphor is trying to communicate about how I was seeing God when I was 18 years old. So let's fast forward to 2018, and this would be right when I'm starting to teach students, and I have definitely evolved in the way that I have seen God through metaphor. And my students love this exercise. They love to analyze how I've changed over the years. Some of them will see it positively, and some of them will see it as a de-evolution, and be a little scandalized at how my metaphors have changed, even though each one of them is a biblical metaphor. So my students, and you might also see, one of the most primary changes to this is that the center here. So I no longer really identify or find a lot of, I guess, meaning or helpfulness of the central metaphor God as Father, as I once did when I was 18 years old. Now I often think of God as parent, and that's become a very meaningful metaphor for me. But students will also note that there's some other metaphors like creator and rock that have kind of come out from the shadows and really risen up in importance over the years for me. And then students are also slightly disturbed by the fact that they find more unfamiliar metaphors like hunter, which you can see over on this side. I think bear is here somewhere. There it is. Lion. All of these, they're a little more disturbed by. And so we have to do a little bit of talking about that. But again, one chart is not better than the other. I get students to compare their charts as well, but I do think it's a helpful activity to either do as an individual or as a corporate community to start thinking about how metaphors are being communicated, whether it is to, especially to children, I find that really important, but whether it's being communicated through the scripture that is read, the songs that are sung, the prayers that are prayed, or even just general language about how people refer to God. And so a question always comes up to me is, well, why does this matter? Why does it matter the way that we speak about God today? Like, does metaphor matter, or is it just an ornament? And today I really want to talk about the fact that metaphor does matter. Metaphor reflects values, metaphor reflects theology, and the way that we see the world. And so one way this analysis is really helpful is that I think it becomes really quickly evident how few metaphors are used for God today. So when my students do these word clouds, I mean, they would usually have less metaphors than I do in my 1998 example. There's a lack of diversity of metaphor. And I think this permeates Christian culture all the way to the core. And the term Father and God for many have become a primary metaphor, one of the only or the most meaningful ways that they see the divine. And so the term Father, Father and God have become so synonymous for many Christians that it is common for them to say, God is Father, rather than God is like a father. And so that plays with that idea of the metaphor and the simile I mentioned earlier, that God is Father takes away any of that distance between God and Father and basically equates them as the same thing. And so I spoke earlier of the is and is not quality of the metaphor. And when it comes to father imagery, again, like there's very little tension for a lot of people. God is Father, full stop, right? They don't see the dissimilarity. They only see what is alike. And there's actually a term for this in metaphor theory, and it's called the dead metaphor or the inactive metaphor. And it's called a dying metaphor because this metaphor, when the kind of the target and the source are so closely aligned, you can no longer recognize it as a metaphor. It loses its potency. It loses that shock of awareness that I spoke of earlier. And when you can no longer distinguish between the two objects, that metaphor loses any power to communicate. And so you can see from my own chart that I've adopted God as parent, partly as a way to remind myself that God is not inherently male, that God is spirit, according to scripture. And there are many reasons why God as Father has been problematic for people, whether it is their home lives, their backgrounds, perhaps of abuse, perhaps of a distant father, perhaps they just did not have a father. There's many reasons why having only one metaphor for God is really troubling and I think is dangerous for people. And my point here, though, is not to advocate getting rid of God as Father as metaphor, but I think it's interesting how much we emphasize this metaphor in culture, because for the Old Testament, it was not the primary metaphor. The main metaphors, just kind of three main metaphors that cluster around God in terms of how Israel saw God, and that was God as king, God as judge, and God as warrior. And today I'll mainly be talking about God as warrior. But these three ways you can really see the primariness of these metaphors. They're all throughout the Psalms, all throughout the prophets. And so when Jesus uses the term Abba or Father in the New Testament, this would have been really different because for the ancient Israelites, God as warrior was one of their primary metaphors. It's not that God as father didn't exist, it wasn't at the forefront of how they actually discuss their relationship with God. And so when Jesus uses Abba, it does something. There's a bit of a shock, an awareness. It's a recognition of a relationship that had always been there. But the fact that Jesus really emphasizes that intimacy, there is that shock of awareness and recognition that Sally Mifeg talks about when these two dissimilar ideas are brought together. And so God as Father, I would argue, is in danger of no longer working the same way because the metaphor has become somewhat institutionalized or fossilized even. And I think sometimes we're missing that shock, that spark of these two ideas that come together. We're not recognizing the limits of human language. And so to do that, I want to kind of show you how we can reinvigorate metaphor by digging deeply into some three metaphors that are a bit more uncanny and a bit more unfamiliar. All right, so the first one we're going to look at is the holy eyelid. And I'm going to start perhaps the most strangest imagery I find for God in the Old Testament. And I recently tried to convince a worship leader to find a hymn that extols the holy eyelid or even to write a song about the holy eyelid. But for some reason, yeah, he wasn't interested. He had no desire to go down that road. And as I said before, when I bring up this image for God, I get incredulous looks from my students. And they deny outright that this could even possibly be a biblical metaphor. And so I then get the opportunity to introduce them to the Song of Moses, which is found in Deuteronomy 32. And if you haven't had the chance to ever read this chapter of Deuteronomy, I encourage you to. It is full of metaphor upon metaphor. And so you find that God is described primarily as a rock. That would be the main metaphor of this passage. But in addition, God is presented as a father, an eagle, and a nursing mother. And each of these images builds on one another, reinforcing mainly the idea of protection and the nurture of God for God's people. But within this chapter, hidden in just this one verse, I want to focus on this metaphor. So let me read it for you. It says, God sustained him, Israel, in a desert land, in a howling wilderness waste. He shielded him, cared for him, guarded him as the apple of his eye. And so the Song of Moses is set in the wilderness time, the wanderings from Egypt to Canaan. And here we find that the Israelites are confronted with the starkness of the wilderness. They're exposed to the elements night and day. And I love this line, a howling wilderness waste, because this really impresses upon us the fact that they are in the middle of nowhere, right? There's no shelter for them. It's just their tents. There's nothing else beyond that. And picking up on earlier metaphors of God as protector, the writer writes, he, God, shielded him, cared for him, and guarded him as the apple of his eye. And it's really easy to quickly move past this metaphor and to go towards the more familiar ones, like God is a rock. But the Hebrew people here are actually described as the apple of God's eye. And this is what we would call the pupil or the eyeball. And even though I have been referring to God, a little facetiously as the holy eyelid, the term eyelid you don't find in this text, right? It nowhere says God is the holy eyelid that protected Israel. Instead, what we find is that this is an implied metaphor, that God is the lid that covers and protects the pupil. And I love this metaphor, even though it's weird and strange, because it talks about this idea of God shielding and caring for the pupil in a very reflexive and automatic way. And so as the eyelid on the human eye, you don't have to ask it, right, to shield you from the sun or from the dust or the dirt. It does that reflexively. And until I started working on this talk, I hadn't really dug in deep to the fact that the wilderness setting is pivotal for understanding this metaphor. And we might think of desert as a place of sand and sand dunes, but the Sinai wilderness would be much more rockier and mountainous, but still just as isolated and open to the elements. And these weary wilderness travelers would have been intimately familiar with the dust and sun that beams down and shines on them for hours upon hours. And the image of a God that is an eyelid reinforces the fact that God instinctively cares and protects Israel, and there's no hesitation. The eyelid moves automatically to shield the eye from danger. And I think not only does this metaphor talk about God's protection, but it also reinforces Israel's vulnerability, that they absolutely needed this protection. And what's interesting though, we might say, well, this isn't unusual. It's a one-off. You know, you can't find this anywhere else. It's just a little bit of a strange metaphor. We can dismiss it. But you also find it in Psalm 17, verse 8, where it says, keep me as the apple of your eye, hide me in the shadow of your wings. And what I love about metaphor, especially in the Psalms or in the prophets, is you don't always get one metaphor. You usually get metaphors that build upon one another, because I think there's a recognition that the human language cannot capture the kind of the expansiveness of who God is. And so they need more than one metaphor to do this. Okay, so the second metaphor I want to look at is a little more unsettling. So maybe not quite as weird. We're moving more into an unsettling territory. And this one might be a tad bit more familiar for you, because this is the metaphor as God as divine hunter, but I'm going to focus first on God as lion. And you might know this as a title for Jesus in the New Testament, the Lion of Judah. And as with most metaphors, there's fluidity in how one understands them. There's both a positive application and usually a negative application. And so when we think of God as lion, you might come up with the more positive attributes that God, like notions of protection, strength, maybe even royalty. And the prophets Isaiah, Hosea, and Joel all showcase a God as a lion who protects and guards Israel. But inherent in this metaphor, God as lion, is also that the lion is dangerous and threatening and is wild. And so, what happens when the lion turns upon you? What happens when the lion turns upon Israel? That very same metaphor that gave Israel a sense of protection now becomes a really dangerous and scary metaphor. The reader is faced with a terror of looking into the eyes of this wild creature. And this negative and terrifying metaphor for God is not unfamiliar in the Hebrew Bible. I think it's unfamiliar to people today, but in ancient Israel, it was a pretty common way of understanding God. And especially when it comes to when the covenant relationship, so this binding agreement between Israel and God that you find throughout the Hebrew Bible, when Israel violates that covenant, whether it's through false worship, through social injustice, through making treaties with other nations, God sees that as disloyalty, as a breaking of this relationship. And when that happens, judgment always comes next. And that judgment is pretty horrific at times, especially if you're familiar with the prophets. And what we find though is, especially if you know anything about Israeli history, there's an iconic moment in 587 BCE when God sends the Babylonians, this army from the east, to come and destroy the Jerusalem temple. And many people are killed, disease kills off more, and a bunch of people are also taken into exile into Babylon. And so the entire nation is unsettled, disoriented, but not only because of the destruction brought by the Babylonians, but because that destruction comes at the hand of God. And so we hear this sentiment in a book called Lamentations. And I don't know how familiar you are with Lamentations. I like to see it as an eyewitness account of the day after. What happens when the dust settles from this Babylonian attack? And here I have a little bit of snippet from Lamentations chapter 3. So our writer says, He, God, has walled me about so that I cannot escape. He has put heavy chains on me, though I call and cry for help. He shuts out my prayer. He has blocked my ways with hewn stone. He has made my paths crooked. He is a bear lying in wait for me, a lion in hiding. He has led me off my way and torn me to pieces. He has made me desolate. He has bent his bow and set me as a mark for his arrow. This is hard language to read, and I think it was just as hard in ancient times as it is today. And it's not simply, again, that the city itself is destroyed, but that God claims responsibility. The prophets say that God was the one who whistled for the Babylonians to come in. And here we see that God is the bear that lies in wait, ready to attack. God is the lion who once protected their city that is now turned against them and torn them to pieces. And layered upon these images of God as a wild beast, we also see that God is the warrior who sets Israel in his sights by taking aim with his arrow or with his sword. And these metaphors are disruptive. They are earth-shattering. The writer takes images that once brought comfort and turns them against the people to unsettle them, to destabilize them. And if you keep reading through Lamentations, I think there's a moment where we find that the writer is similarly uncomfortable with what they're saying. And what they end up doing is saying, okay, well, in a way, like taking the blame off of God by then saying, well, actually, Israel, you're at fault. It's your fault that all this has happened. You have sinned, you have been unfaithful, and God has brought justice through this judgment to you. And it's up to you whether or not you think the writer is successful in convincing the reader that, that to excuse or to perhaps dismiss this unsettling imagery of God as the enemy or the hunter here. But again, I would argue that these images of God are disorienting. And I think that's why we don't often hear about them today. And if we could end here with Lamentations, with this sort of like papering over the difficult passage, I think it would be a little bit easier, but to kind of accept this violent imagery of God. But I want to take us to another writer, and that is Job. And Job is a particular favorite of mine because Job doesn't let us cover up the uncomfortable nature of God. Job asks us to look straight into the face of the divine and to really recognize that we're staring into the face of a being that is uncomfortable, unsettling. And this is where I would go to monster theory very easily, that we're looking into the face of a monster. But before Job gets there, which is post chapter 3 of Job, you probably know more the prologue, or at least that's my experience with people. So I'm very familiar with the prologue because it's written in a narrative and it's very, very easy to read compared to the rest of Job, which is written in speeches that can be a little more difficult to make one's way through. But Job is known particularly for the suffering he experiences. And it is a favorite of many. And what is amazing of Job is that I say it's set up a bit as a divine riddle, because in chapter 1 of Job, we find out that Job is blameless and upright. And again, people are answer, well, no one is blameless and upright, but Job is. And so that is a bit of the divine riddle. And Job suffers terribly. He loses his children, his servants, his wealth, his status. Eventually, he'll lose even like his health is attacked. And at the beginning in Job chapter 1 and 2, he responds to the suffering with sentiments like the following: naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And then at the end of chapter 2, he says, shall we receive the good and not the bad at the hand of God? Oh, sorry, shall we receive the good at the hand of God and not receive the bad? And so these are these like moments that people point to in Job of his righteousness, of his faith, despite everything that's happening. And if we stop there, we would have this noble picture of a man who suffers, yet does not lose faith in God. But if we continue and we read into the speeches of Job that span the rest of the book, you would find a very different picture of a man that might make you a little more uncomfortable. My students have a really hard time with the book of Job because he continues to plead his innocence. He continues to request and even demand a meeting with God. And basically, he wants to put God on trial and say, God, I am innocent. What's going on? Why am I suffering? Because I have not done anything wrong. And Job 16 is a great chapter. There's other chapters that do this, but I wanted to focus on Job chapter 16 because we know that Job is not wrong. Job is actually entirely correct. He is blameless and upright. And we know that the only reason he suffers is because a divine bet between God and the Hasatan, or the Satan figure, what Christians come later to know as the devil, they've entered into this bet to see, how righteous is Job? How much does he truly love God? And is there an end point to his faithfulness? And so the Hasatan is given the permission by God to strike him in many ways, whether it's losing his children, his wealth, or his health. And we know that Job is entirely, his words are blameless, that he has the right of it. And so it's this wonderful book that really forces you to come face to face with the uncanniness of God. Job's friends, on the other hand, are incensed. They're angry because they don't understand this stream of words pouring from Job's mouth that to them seems irreverent, perhaps heretical, if we want to use that language. But through it all, Job does not change. He continues to direct his words to God. And so I want to read you this little snippet from Job chapter 16, full of metaphoric language, similar to Lamentations. Job says, He, God, has torn me in his wrath and hated me. He has gnashed his teeth at me. My adversary sharpens his eyes against me. God gives me up to the ungodly and casts me into the hands of the wicked. I was at ease and he broke me in two. He seized me by the neck and dashed me to pieces. He set me up as his target. His archers surround me. He slashes open my kidneys and shows no mercy. He pours out my gall on the ground. He bursts upon me again and again. He rushes at me like a warrior. I've sewn sackcloth onto my skin and have laid my strength in the dust. My face is red with weeping, and deep darkness is on my eyelids, though there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. So again, you can see here that the Hebrew Bible has stacked metaphor upon metaphor. We see that God is described as a wild animal who gnashes his teeth at Job. That God is a commander that let loose his archers upon Job as a target. That God is a warrior that attacks him. And unlike all the metaphors I'm talking today of God as eyelid and God as midwife, this is not an uncommon metaphor. This is a very familiar one to the Jewish people. And we see it earlier in Job as well, that God is compared to a bold lion that hunts him. And this language is difficult to swallow. I can understand why we don't use it in worship music. However, I've found some poets who actually do use this. And it appears perhaps irreverent. It's hard to think about how one would incorporate this, but it is incorporated into the Psalms, which are the worship music of ancient Israel. And so it is not marginal. It was deeply ingrained in their sense of self, their experience of God. And I find it deeply interesting that they don't shy away from this difficult imagery. So I'd like to move on to a third metaphor, and that is God as midwife. And I call this uncanny, not because I think it's uncanny, but I think our culture has a really hard time with language that is gendered for God, especially female gendered language for God. However, the midwife is a great metaphor because it really speaks to the use of the metaphor to communicate liberation or redemption. And often Israel uses language that invokes the military. So God is a warrior that redeems Israel from Egypt, or God is the warrior that slays the sea monster in the seas and brings about rescue for the Israeli people. But here in Psalm 22, we have language of God as a midwife who saves Israel. And the poet, I think, intentionally turns away from this military language to embracing God as a midwife. And so even though language for God is a female, or female language for God is considered suspect by people today in the contemporary world, this is not at all the case in ancient Israel. Ancient authors would randomly throw in references to God as father and mother in the same text. So we hear about God as a mother bird, a birthing mother, a seamstress, an angry mother bear, and even a midwife. But where are these metaphors today? Why don't we use them? Why are they considered suspect? And so this is just an example. Julian in Norwich, if you're familiar with her work at all, back in the 13th century, she was using language of God as mother. And I really do wonder why it was apparent to her in the 13th century, but today it's still a difficult concept for people to wrap their minds around. So even just the first quote here, she says, "And so I saw that God rejoices that he is our father, and God rejoices that he is our mother, and God rejoices that he is our true spouse, and our soul, his much loved bride." But what I want to focus on is Psalm 22. It's probably a psalm that you recognize. And I have to admit, I taught this for many years with students at U of T, and we spent time dissecting the Hebrew, breaking apart the structure, looking at the genre, And I never actually paid any attention to the midwifery imagery in the psalm. I noticed it, but I moved on pretty quickly. And I think a lot of people do the same. And so I want us to look at, I'm going to actually just read the whole thing for you, and it will be one that's quite familiar to you, but I want you to think about why this language is used and kind of the comparisons that are happening. And so it begins with a very famous line, my God, why have you forsaken me and are so far from my salvation? From the words of my distress. Oh my God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not answer, and by night also, but I find no rest. Yet you were the Holy One enthroned upon the praises of Israel. Our forebears trusted in you. They trusted in you, delivered them. They cried out to you and were delivered. They put their trust in you and were not confounded. But as for me, I am a worm and no man, scorned by all and despised by the people. All who laugh me to scorn, they curl their lips and wag their heads, saying, oh, sorry, wrong screen. Here we go. He trusted in the Lord. Let him deliver him. Let him deliver him if he delights in him. And this is the line. But it is you that took me out of the womb and laid me safe upon my mother's breast. On you I was cast ever since I was born. You are my God, even from my mother's womb. Be not far from me, for trouble is near at hand, and there is none to help. So this psalm probably sounds familiar to you, especially the first line, my God, why have you forsaken me? One of the last lines that Jesus says on the cross. And what's interesting, though, that this is the context of a psalm, a lament. This is a psalm that it helps people process trauma. It helps people move from deep despair to hope. Most times, there's one or two psalms that don't actually end with very much hope. But this is where we start with our speaker. They feel abandoned by God. They can't find God. You find this earlier, whether it's in the day or the night, God is nowhere where they can find him. And although they feel abandoned, they do keep speaking to God. And that's the point of the lament, that they never stop speaking to God. And they trust that God is going to hear their cry. In verse 4, the psalmist trusts that God is going to hear them, just as God listened to their ancestors and helped their ancestors and rescued them. So that language of they cried out to you and they were delivered. So the psalmist today trusts in God because God helped them in the past. There are at least 3 different verbs used here for this idea of to be rescued or to deliver. And the psalmist obviously knows the language of the warrior who saves Israel, but that doesn't seem to help the psalmist feel a sense of relief. Instead, they move quickly to this language of the midwife. And this idea that it is in this image of the midwife, God who rescues them, that seems to bring them more comfort than they were finding before. And so the warrior God is replaced by a midwife, a woman who presides over life and death. She comes to the aid of mothers in a time when women's average life expectancy was 30 years of age. And the likelihood of dying in childbirth, like Rachel in the Old Testament, was a real and present danger. And here, the God envisioned by the psalmist is one that's physically present by drawing the baby from the womb, a process that's messy and difficult before placing the baby at the mother's breast. And so, is this metaphor of God dominant in Scripture? No, it shows up here and in Psalm 71. But as we see in Psalm 22, it's not insignificant in the least. It is pivotal in helping the psalmist move from despair to hope. In their old traditions of a warrior God that saves, the psalmist still feels absent and alone. They trust that God is going to deliver them, but it's the image of God as midwife that brings them actual comfort. Scholar Juliana Claessens has written all about this, and in a couple pieces. It's really lovely the way she says we shouldn't ignore marginal images of God. That the marginal, the ones that maybe don't get as much airtime, they're just as important. And I do think here, the fact that this midwifery imagery has survived at least in 2 different texts is a bit of a miracle and fantastic. And I do think that there is room to still bring this out and to cling to metaphors that bring life, that really talk about God as life-giving, rather than these older metaphors of God as a warrior who saves through violence. And so I do have another slide that I won't get to, but I do talk a little bit in the rest of the paper about the dangers of the warrior God, especially as it links to issues around colonialism. And so you may probably are very familiar with the term manifest destiny, but this idea that the warrior god became a dominant metaphor for the expansion westward in the United States and Canada, where Europeans and Americans and Canadians saw or believed that they were a new Israel and that the land was given to them, just like God gave the land to Israel. And there's all sorts of problems, as we know, with this. And I can speak more to this in the question and answer period. But from a Canadian perspective, we're dealing a lot with the consequences of this theology and how it has really decimated and destroyed Indigenous culture. And so that's one way that I think that this language of the midwife could be a counterpoint to the ways that God as warrior has been warped in Christian history, not just in North America, but also the Crusades. Issues around apartheid also use this kind of language of conquest and of being a warrior. And so I do think these marginal images have a real place to play in today and how people conceive of God, whether it's just in the language they use or the songs they sing or the prayers that they use. And so in conclusion, these metaphors of the divine are all incomplete. They are human attempts to capture the divine, and ultimately they all will fail. But whether God is a warrior or a shepherd, an angry mother bear, a determined midwife, or even a rock, each of these images help us to gain a glimpse of how God works. When we ignore the minor images of the divine, one's view of God becomes flattened, and we risk seeing God only an image of those in positions of power and dominance. And so my goal for the talk today is to bring to light some forgotten metaphors that have been hiding in the pages of the Bible. And do I think that hymns extolling the holy eyelid will become popular or be written? I don't, unfortunately. Is the image of God as Father truly a dead metaphor? Probably not. But what is most important is for individuals and communities to understand the importance of language and how it defines and sometimes even places limits on how we conceive of the divine. When God is only thought of as a father or shepherd, one's image of the divine is safe and comforting. But when God emerges as a lion or as a hunter, our assumptions turn to dust in the face of an uncanny and an unsettling and maybe even a monstrous God. The metaphors we turn to can say more about us than the one they describe. And I really like this metaphor by Neil Postman. He says, a metaphor is not an ornament. It is an organ of perception. Through metaphors, we see the world as one thing or another. Metaphors matter. They aren't extra flourishes. Instead, they impart truth of the way humans have recorded their encounters with God, even when they're only partially successful. Thank you.
Oh, my stars. My mind is just wow. Oh my gosh, wow. So I am a recovering English major and seminary grad or minister. And so you have hit, I mean, when you start with what is a metaphor, I'm immediately drawn in. So what a treat. Teresa, I don't know if you want to jump on. I've got a whole list of questions here that I want to ask, but I don't want to. Well, here we go. Oh, and you'll need to unmute.
Okay. First of all, Cameron, I second what you say. The talk was just a delight. I love the clarity and the complexity, Heather, that you bring to this by unpacking these things that so often go by unnoticed. I appreciate your willingness to recognize the metaphors, then bear down on them and think about how they have meaning and how they accumulate meaning. In other words, we often hear about, oh, don't mix your metaphors, right? Because that dilutes everything. On the other hand, some writers and some storytellers who are trying to get at something really meaningful build on those metaphors, as you've said, and you point that out in a really, really interesting, I think, and meaningful way. I do find myself wondering, as I think you do, why there's this impulse to run away from the complexity and the depth that these metaphors can bring to us. And I'm reminded of a quote from your book. And by the way, I look forward to the second book. I know it's a lot of work. I look forward to it. Get on it, okay? But you have here, he's talking about, this is Paul Middleton talking about the violence of Jesus and how it's excused as metaphorical. And he says, he argues that these interpretations owe more to contemporary theological concerns than an attempt to understand John's imagination. And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how this hiding from metaphor, this glossing over so many discomforting things, is really not about the storyteller's unwillingness to reveal a truth to us, but for some reason, our unwillingness to see it.
Absolutely. And I think some of this comes back to a short history for modern day Christians. Because even like John Donne, the poet, he has language of like God ravishing one's heart or battering one's soul. I mean, there's all sorts of poets who do actually use this language. And again, they're using it metaphorically, but they're aware of it. And I find today, I mean, I make jokes about modern worship music of Jesus is my friend or Jesus is my boyfriend. Like if we're gonna get
Right,
really like
right.
that, but
Yeah.
I think a lot of people want safety, they want protection, perhaps a little bubble wrapping from how difficult the world is around them. And they are never ever taught these difficult passages. And a lot of times these passages, I mean, I'm working right now through a gender in the Hebrew Bible course with my students, and they're not even familiar with Deborah. Like they don't even know her as a person, and they don't know that there's a strong female leader who is in charge of the political and the religious sphere. Like she's a direct vehicle
Mm-hmm.
of God to speak to the people. So I do think there's an intentional muting of these metaphors that make one uncomfortable. And I think, especially if it gets to the violence of God, we want to explain that away. It doesn't fit with our paradigm of who God is. I think we unintentionally adopt the paradigm of the Old Testament, God is violent, and the New Testament is a God of grace and love and mercy. And that's probably why I was drawn so much to the book of Revelation, because it's an outlier in a way.
Right,
I
right.
find it much more similar to the Old Testament. And again, I would not have that binary of old and new. I don't see that at all. But I do think that with metaphors, it's just easy to see God as a rock, God as a fortress. And I do think it's putting God in a certain box that's comfortable. To let God out of that box is this idea of the uncanny, the unsettling. I talk about in the book, what's his name? Otto talks about the mysterium tremendum, right? Like
Right,
that
right.
when when you accept these unsettling metaphors, you realize that you're a creature, that you're not the creator. And I do find that a very helpful way to think about why we're so uncomfortable with these metaphors.
Thank you so much. I'm afraid I could talk to you for a long time, or I mean more aptly, I could listen to you for a long time, but I will turn it back to Cameron, and I want to thank you on behalf of the forum for coming. And I'm serious as I can be. I want to see that next book soon.
Oh,
Thank
thank
you.
you.
All right, Cameron, take it away.
Teresa, I can tell you're an English professor. You've got that, you know, expectation,
Yes,
setting
yes,
aspirations for your
that's right.
people. I love it.
That's right. That's right.
So you mentioned the political reality and Canadian the Canadian context, and of course, the whole world is terrified about the political context of the United States at the moment. Um, uh, so we've got the rise of Christian nationalism, running amok here. How do the metaphors of Christian nationalism differ from other expressions? Maybe my bias will say more holistic, um, deeper expressions of the Christian tradition. Are you seeing anything there we need to learn from?
I do. It definitely was in the back of my mind, the rise of Christian nationalism, which we also have here in Canada as well. Um, this idea of violence, and I think also the ways that metaphor uses God as warrior, it's hard to separate the metaphor, because when people adopt the God as warrior, then they adopt themselves as warrior, and it's their job to bring whatever they want through violence. And I do think that these ideas of God as midwife, God as mother, God as nursing mother, actually sometimes they are paired in passages where God is warrior. And I do think that there is there's a need to see that there's a nurturing and, as you say, a holistic aspect to God, and that to recognize that God is warrior. They were in a warrior culture. They did want a warrior back then. All the gods were warrior gods, but that we have these alternate metaphors today. And I find it interesting that the New Testament does not pick up on this warrior imagery for the most part. There's a little bit of it, but for a lot of it, they do turn to the Abba, the father, the parental. And I do think that the midwife, like family metaphors, I think can really help people today to have a different way of seeing the world rather than seeing it through us versus them. Because I think that's the danger of the warrior metaphor is that it compartmentalizes people. Whereas the midwifery imagery or mother imagery, and you could even say father imagery, is one of caring for others. Especially, I love the midwife one because it's the idea of like broken bodies or bodies that are hurting. And I do think there's a lot more potential there. And I do think we need more metaphors to
Yeah.
combat definitely, yeah, this rise
Yeah.
of the church as yeah, this warrior nation to reclaim the past, perhaps.
One of my soapbox speeches that I give is that it seems like the collective story that Western culture has told itself to get it to this point is insufficient, is too small to carry us in any kind of sustainable way going forward. If we keep the collective story going, God is warrior or God is male or any of these oppressive contexts, we will continue to consume our planet, continue to invest in violet masculinity, etc. So it seems we need a new story. And what you're actually saying is, but we need new metaphors to guide that story. I loved the way you started with the exercise of writing the metaphors and so I was thinking, how did I think of God when I was, a teenager, and then as a 20 something, and then as a 30 something, and at 40 something, and I'll stop there. But have you noticed, like, what are the metaphors that your students are using? Like, what's the imagination of that generation now? Is it the same as the metaphors that were true for you?
To an extent, definitely God as Father is like number one.
Okay.
Um, God as rock and fortress continue to be really big. One year, God as cornerstone showed up, and I thought, what is going on with the cornerstone? And we
Yeah.
dug a little deeply, and it was that there was a worship song they all loved, that the cornerstone. And because it was a worship song they sung like week after week, they didn't even know where that came from. They had to really think about it. They're like, oh, we love this song and it's called Cornerstone. I'm like, well, that's why it's showing up because
Yeah.
that's a really random like metaphor for them to cling to. God as
Yeah.
shepherd would be another one. So I do think that, and one thing that comes up with metaphors is there's a difference in how people understand them. Like sometimes like people see them just as ornaments. They're just like things to make your writing pop, right? But Lakoff and Johnson have talked a lot about this idea of metaphors as like reflecting our values. They say something about us. And so if people are only hearing the same metaphor again and again and again, it will shape their story. And I think what's interesting is that the Hebrew Bible has many metaphors. It isn't content with one metaphor. Like even in a passage, even in a verse, it will be, I think the one I said, like, God is, I forget which one it was, but like God is a midwife and God is sheltering you under God's wings, right? So there's like a bird and a midwife and one image. And so the Hebrew Bible, I think, has a lot of potential. It's a model for perhaps the church to understand that you can't just use one metaphor. And especially if your metaphor reflects yourself. So if God is male, are you really
Right.
speaking about the divine or are you speaking about yourself? And so that's one thing to think about with metaphor is what is the purpose of the metaphor and what are you trying to communicate by using it?
Yes. One of my heartbreaks in watching the political climate in the US at the moment is that individualism and fear of othering each other seems to be the dominant um, go-to. It's the instinct, and I find myself, channeling Thomas Aquinas, who makes a call for the common good, the
Mhm.
care for the common good. That's actually the whole premise of having laws, was for the concern of the common good. He was the first person to use that phrase. Um, uh, I'm finding myself wondering if there's a project in your work or among your students, or of um, it seems to me we don't just need a number of new metaphors. There are actually some very particular kinds of metaphors that we need operating right now, almost as if treating the condition of what ails us at the moment. So do you have instincts about which metaphors are more useful, more helpful to where humanity is at the moment? Midwife, I know I've heard you say, but what else do we need to kind of treat this division, individualism, and fear that we've got?
A little bit. I mean, I have been thinking about a lot of times we focus on like what the metaphor is, like God as rock, God as shepherd. And I've been thinking more about the purpose of the metaphor. So metaphors that cluster around a theme. So God as redeemer and savior, looking at like God as warrior is one of them, but almost to say like, okay, maybe we can't use this one anymore, but
Yeah.
what can we use to replace it? So whether it's God as midwife or God as angry mother bear, is another one, right? That is, um, it's still violent, and a lot of these are both. They're both protection and violence. Like I think we want to just see God in a positive light, but I think most metaphors have a shadow side to them, where we see both sides of the divine. And so yes, I've thought about that. I've thought about this idea too of like in the activity I did, where in the second one I had more inanimate metaphors.
Mhm.
I didn't really get into it, but I've been reading and thinking with some indigenous scholars, and they remind us that rocks are not inanimate, like in the Cree language, that they have an
Mm.
animacy to them in their language. Like a chair is inanimate because it's made by people, but a rock is not. And so I've been thinking a lot about the Hebrew Bible and its concept of animation, and that we draw very firm lines, basically, like in Western society, of like what is okay to see as God and what is not. And I do think that when we see God as a rock, we see it in a very particular way that I think
Yeah.
Indigenous communities would see in a very different way. So I think that in talking with Indigenous communities or talking with other communities around the world, like a global perspective, can actually help see the value in these metaphors. Because it wasn't until I was reading Indigenous theology that I thought, oh, well, wait a minute. The Hebrew
Yes.
people actually are seeing nature very similar to how Indigenous folk are.
I have to ask you the question I ask everyone. Have you read Braiding Sweetgrass?
I am 3/4 of the way through
Oh,
it.
it's the best. It's the best. If I could make a recommendation of a sacred text of our day and age, like this is the book. I would just so recommend it. Can I ask you a couple more questions? Are you okay?
Yep,
Uh,
go for it.
you again took us on this beautiful walk through scripture. And I wonder if you, and I don't like using the Old and New Testament frame either, but let's just say it's a library of books written over time to talk about our understanding of God and how that understanding evolves. Um, uh, have you noticed an evolution of the metaphors used from Genesis to Revelation that was interesting to you? Like, is there a way in which humanity's metaphoric imagination um, changed over the many books?
So I'd actually say there's a lessening of diversity of metaphors from the Old Testament to
Not good news.
not good news. And
Let's try that again. No.
but I actually think there's a reason for it,
Okay.
because the Old Testament spans like 1,000 years.
Yeah.
It is such a big book, like, and I think people forget that that the time frame of the Old Testament is just massive, and so many communities went into making that book. Versus the New Testament, it's like 100 and so years, right? It's just a tiny, tiny little sliver of time. And so to have the expectations of the New Testament that one has for the Old Testament, I think would be unfair to the New Testament.
Yes.
Jesus does use the language of a mother hen, so we definitely do have female imagery being reused. But I do think we have that, like the shepherd and the father imagery, especially coming to the forefront in the New Testament. But I do think what has helped me see it is that when Jesus uses father imagery, that I think he's doing something rather radical that today has become just normal. But I think that the way that Jesus was using father imagery to such an extent would have been quite different for people who were used to the God as warrior, God as judge imagery of the Old Testament. So I think we need to reorient the way that we're seeing the use of metaphor, because I think that modern day Christians or the society just adopts the New Testament as the norm or the standard. So yeah, I do think there is more variety in the Old Testament Hebrew Bible.
Okay. Well, I can go with the it is 1,000 years versus, 100. Yeah, that's true. That's good perspective. Let me just repeat back so I make sure that I'm clear and maybe those listening to us that what Jesus was doing that was so radical was reframing God from warrior to caring parent. Is that what you're suggesting as God making the move to father? Is
I
to
think
add
Sally McFay
compassion?
talks a lot about this idea that we have a diminishing of metaphor, like a crystallization of metaphor into God as Father.
Okay.
Yeah, not as parent, but
Yeah.
as Father.
Okay. But
And
trying to work in compassion and okay. So
you still do have God as warrior in places. Like you definitely, it does not go away completely. God is judge. I mean, there are parts in the New Testament that no one wants to talk about, where angels come in and usher people off into Hades. And so there are some really violent passages in the New Testament. There's violent passages that Jesus talks about that people don't want to talk about either. So you could take everything I've just done with the Hebrew Bible and you could do it to the New Testament as well.
yeah, those are awkward. I like the idea of the fierce mother bear because the way you were talking about it, maybe it's violent, but it seemed boundaried. There's a maternal protection there that I think offers us um, some good ways to let our imagination flow. Teresa, do you want to jump back in?
I do. Just a couple of things. One, when we're talking about all these metaphors and the tendency for some of them to be overlooked, I think it goes to the ways of interpretation generally. That is, how we interpret often reveals more about us than it reveals about the text. Likewise, which metaphors we're drawn to and which ones we shove to the side reveal a whole lot about us individually, but as a community and as a time period. So if we look at what was being embraced in ancient times versus what's being embraced or sloughed over right now, I think we can get a pretty good read on where our culture is simply by way of which metaphors are being celebrated and which ones are being ignored, right? And so I want to give you an opportunity to speak to that, even though I'm saying so much. But Heather, I wanted to add one more point, and that was when you were talking about in your book about the lion imagery. And on the one hand, that's the protector. That's really great. On the other hand, if you're Job, the intended target, it's not so great, right? But either way, and this was really interesting to me, in either case, the recipient of God's actions is hunted, mauled, or torn to pieces without any hope of escape. The outcome is the same, but one's perspective shifts depending on the relationship to this beast. And I'm thinking that these two ideas are connected, the relationship to the quotation marks beast and the receptivity to various metaphors. If that's too jumbled up to unpack, okay, but if you have a word, I'd love to hear it.
Sure. I think I think something I've been struggling with a lot is that people want to see a single story. There's a great TED talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie who talks about the danger of a single story. And she talks about the fact that like we can have multiple experiences. And the Hebrew Bible does a fantastic job sometimes, but when it does a fantastic job of showing multiple experiences. And so we have places in the Hebrew Bible where we think that we have multiple sources that are remembering the same event in very different ways, and they're both allowed to stay. And that's why you have a couple names for Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb. Depends if you're coming from the south or the north. Both communities, they don't necessarily have the same exact memory, but both memories are a given space in the Hebrew Bible. And I find today that students don't like it, and others, like communities I talk to, don't want that. They want, like, this is the truth, this is the story, and they're not okay with that tension. And I would say the same with metaphor. I think people want a metaphor of God is good, right? Like that is the overwhelming thing that people want to get out of this. God is good. And we could go to C.S. Lewis, because C.S. Lewis does a great job with Aslan as a lion. And he might say God is good, but God is also wild and God is dangerous. And I think that's the part of metaphor, of the receptivity, is that people don't continue on with the metaphor. They just see that one part that makes them feel good and safe and comforted, but they don't want to accept the whole metaphor and realize that there is an is and is not to the metaphor, that there is a part of God that is dangerous and wild and monstrous, perhaps.
Okay, one more comment, if I may, and that is, you mentioned the Bible as bringing in more than one story, or telling some stories more than one time so that we get different perspectives. And I agree, that's really important to get that kind of 360 view of something. But it also reminds me of some of your own work. That is, with monster theory, post-colonialism, feminism, and womanist theory. Those are all ways to access a lot of the stories that, like some of these metaphors, have been kind of glossed over a little bit. And that, I think, is the wonderful thing about these theories. It allows you to focus in on a way to really draw out some of these details that we've missed and clarify them, even if you're bringing complexity to it. And of course, that's just wonderful. That's wonderful. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, we are at the end of our time, which I think Teresa and I are particularly sad about. But
Yes.
this has been an absolute joy and an incredible provocation to help us think more deeply about our sacred text and the time in which we live. So, Heather, thank you for your work. I'm going to join Teresa's call for the second book. I've just pulled up the first one. So you all go Google this extraordinary scholar among us and learn from her. Again, the Anderson Forum for Progressive Theology exists because of your donations. So if you can make a donation to that group, that would be really, really great for them. As always, I am so privileged to be in this partnership and in these conversations. Heather, I hope our paths cross and we can continue to nerd out together on these things. So Teresa, Heather, Steve, to all the folks, thank you all, and everybody have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.